So in this workshop, we're going to be going over the basic functions of soundboards. We're going to start with analog, and then we're also going to look at the digital console. Along the way, we're going to get it a little bit into mixing, just because I don't think you can really teach someone how to use a hammer without also showing them what you're going to be doing with it. So we will be talking a little bit about mixing as we go, but mainly this is just going to be focusing on the functions of the soundboard. It won't really be a complete mixing tutorial. That will be for another time. Fair warning, we're going to talk a lot about routing, because routing is always confusing, and routing is where you're going to make some of your biggest mistakes, most confusing mistakes, and it's also just fundamental to all of this, because routing is how your signal gets from here to there and where it's going, and fundamentally we're moving signal from one place to another place, so it can be amplified and heard better. So so we'll talk a lot about routing, a little bit about mixing, but mainly we're going to learn what all the buttons do. So here we're starting with an analog console. This is the Yamaha MG166CX, and we'll look at that one a little bit too, but I chose this one because of the features that it has. It just has a good representation of some of the different features you'll find on analog consoles. If when it's your first time looking at an analog console, it can be kind of overwhelming. I know you guys already have some experience, but you just see all these different knobs and buttons and faders, and they all kind of look the same. It always makes me think of Ratatouille, the short, with the aliens, where they're driving the spaceship and they have like the console with like the thousands of switches, and he's afraid to touch each switch because they all look the same, and he doesn't want to blow something up. You can kind of have that feeling when you're looking at an analog console, like, oh, I'm afraid to touch this because I don't know what it does. I might ruin something. Just to make it really simple, if you're not past that overwhelmed stage yet, this is split up into vertical columns. And some soundboards it's easier to see than others. This one, you have lines there that make it pretty easy. So signal is not traveling every which way through this. It's traveling down through vertical columns called channel strips. So you don't need to look at this and think, well, there's so many different knobs and buttons, what am I looking at? But you can look at it and you can see columns. Okay, there's this set of controls, and then there's this set of controls, and there's this set of controls. In each column, each channel strip would be a different microphone or a different instrument. So if I plug a microphone in here to channel 1, then I have this set of controls for that input. If I plug a guitar in there, then I have this set of controls for that input. So you have just all these different columns. And for the most part, signal is just traveling down independently through these. So these columns have nothing to do with each other. They're all just doing their own thing. And then when you get to this side of the soundboard, then there's some other things going on that we'll get into later when we talk about routing. But to start with, I just want to take us down through the channel strip one control at a time and explain what's going on here. So up at the top, what we have is the preamplifier. Most of the signals coming into the soundboard are going to be too weak for the soundboard to be useful to the soundboard. It's designed to operate at a higher signal level than what most of the sources will be outputting, especially microphones. Microphones output very weak signal, low voltage signals. Some sources, like keyboards or computer input, if you're playing music, those will be stronger sources. But for the most part, it's pretty weak signals coming in. And to be useful for the soundboard at the signal strength that this operates at, the signal needs to be amplified before it goes anywhere else. So the first thing the signal hits when I plug it in is a preamplifier. And then up here you have the gain. Sometimes it's called trim. And then when you get into digital consoles, there starts to become more of a distinction between gain and trim. But here on an analog console, it might say gain, it might say trim. It's basically the same thing. This is just controlling how much amplification is applied to the signal. And the trick with setting your gain structure is there's always going to be noise in your signal, and there's noise introduced at different points along the way, different components within the soundboard, or later on past the soundboard, like your power amps, or maybe if there's anything before that, any sort of devices or circuitry before the signal gets to the soundboard, there's going to be noise introduced along each of those points, and it all compounds on each other. So your noise floor might start here, but then as more noise gets added to that, noise gets louder and louder, and we want to make sure that our signal is strong enough to be so high above the noise floor that the noise is not even very audible, or at least not very noticeable. So the first thing you want to do when you're line checking and sound checking, and before the show begins, ideally before a rehearsal even begins, if you have time, is get good strong signal coming into your board. Gain it up. If I press this button, we'll come to that later. This is the PAFL or PFL button. I can see on the meter here my signal, and I want to gain it up to a point where I'm getting good strong signal like that, but I don't want it to peak. Check, check, check. When it hits the red, then it's peaking. It can also be called clipping or overload. Basically, it's overloading the circuit. You know, there's only so much signal the circuit can handle, and so the sound wave reaches this limit where it starts to get squared off, and it sounds distorted because it's turning into square waves. So we want to leave headroom. Headroom is a little bit of a like a buffer that accounts for, you know, if there's a louder sound than I'm expecting during the show. We want a little bit of a buffer range so that it never actually peaks and never clips, never reaches the top, but we still want good strong signal. So that's the trick with setting your gains. You know, strong signal, but then also leaving enough headroom that you'll never clip. And you really want to take your time to do that right at the beginning and to do it correctly, because that will set you up for success for the show. And it's always important to remember, it's easy to forget this, and I like starting with analog boards because you can see it laid out here. The preamp comes first. The preamp will affect everything downstream. So sometimes what will happen is when you start getting into the weeds of mixing and all the intricacies of the soundboard, you'll forget that, and you might see the preamp clipping. There's usually like a peak indicator up here too. This one doesn't have that, but you might see it clipping, and then you're thinking, oh no, it's clipping, I should turn down the fader to stop it from clipping, and that doesn't do anything. You know, this is downstream from the preamp. If it's clipping, you need to fix that at the preamp. Or you might be afraid to boost the fader because you're thinking it's going to clip, but it can't do that. This is downstream. The clipping happens here. Preamp always comes first. Or if you didn't set the preamp properly, or something happens unexpected and you're in the middle of the show and all of a sudden it's clipping and now you have to make a change and turn it down, you might not be thinking through the consequences of what that's going to do when you turn that down. It's going to affect how hard you're hitting your processors. It's going to affect the monitors on the stage or in the people's ears. If there's a recording or if there's live streaming, it's going to affect that. You know, any changes you make to the gain, it's going to affect everything. And that's why you don't want to move the gain in the middle of the show if you can help it. It should be a set and forget control as much as possible. You know, give yourself plenty of headroom, but also enough signal that you're not going to need to boost it at all during the show. So yeah, always remember that it comes first, and that it affects everything downstream. You know, set that early, set it right, and that's going to set you up for success during the show. Another thing that is part of the preamp, and if you have a lot of experience on digital consoles, you might forget or you might not even know that this is actually part of the preamp usually, but it's a high pass filter or a low cut. And here, you can take a look if you want. You can stay seated or whatever you want to do, but there's usually a button on an analog console right below the gain control, and that is a high pass filter or a low cut filter. And what that does is there's a certain frequency, it's labeled here 80 hertz. So if I activate that, it will cut all the low frequencies below 80 hertz. So it's a low cut. And typically on an analog board, that's what you'd see it called, a low cut. On a digital board, it's usually called a high pass filter, but it's the same thing. Low cut, it's cutting the lows below 80 hertz. High pass means it's allowing the frequencies above that to pass through. So it's a high pass, it's a low cut, but it means the same thing. For some reason, the terminology changed a little bit when we moved over to analog digital consoles, but it's the same thing. And you can see there's usually like a little graphic next to that gives you a rough idea of how sharp that cut is going to be. It's never like a straight vertical drop off of everything that's cut off, because it doesn't sound good, and it's also not physically possible to do that because of the way filters work with phase shifting. Yeah, so it's never going to be just a complete cutoff of all frequencies below that. There's going to be a slope, and you can see the slope there. So that's actually part of the preamp. And when we get over to the digital console, you'll see they typically will overlay the preamp on top of the EQ, so it can sometimes look like it's part of the EQ, but it actually comes first in the signal chain. It's part of the preamp. Next, below that is a compressor. Not every analog board has a compressor, and that's why I chose this one, because there are some that will have this. This is called a one knob compression. And what compression does is it gives you dynamic control over the signal. So every signal is going to have its ups, it's going to have its downs. Like if I'm talking, there's going to be moments when I'm talking louder, there's moments when I'm talking softer. It's only natural that there's going to be different dynamics going on. But when you're mixing a band and you have all these different instruments that have these ups and downs, it can be really hard to get it all under control and to develop a clear mix where you can clearly hear the guitar and it just kind of stays in its place and the vocal stays in its place. Or maybe it's not even a musical context, maybe it's just somebody speaking and they're moving around a lot, and it's hard to get a good level where it's not blowing people's ears out when they're right on top of it, but you can still hear it pretty good when they're away from it. What a compressor does is it takes those highs and those lows and it compresses them. It kind of reels it in, so there's not as much dynamic variance. So it restricts the dynamics to a certain range, and then what you can do is you can take your fader and you can move that range around. So I can take the guitar, which is this loud and this soft, and I can reel it in, and then I can place it where I want it to be within the dynamics of the mix. And then I can do the same thing with the vocals, compress that, and then maybe turn that up above the guitar. So then everything has its place within the mix because I've compressed it and I've gotten more control over it. So they don't interfere. So the guitar stays where I want it to be. If I put the fader here, it's not going to be jumping way up here and way down there. It's going to be more compressed. It's going to stay where I want it to be.
So in a mix, this is a mixing question, but normally you would want vocals. What order would you want a band in? Would you want vocals on top, and then you'd want, let's just say acoustic next, and then we put like electric, guitar, and then maybe drums? Would that be the correct order, or would there be a different order depending on the situation?
Yeah, normally you want the vocals to be pretty far forward, especially in a live mix, but loudness and vocals can be kind of deceptive. Like, you don't always have to push as loud as you think you do. If you listen to professionally produced music and you pay attention to where the levels are at, you'll find that there are some instruments that are actually just as loud as the vocals, if not louder, but you can still hear the vocals clearly. And a lot of that is because they're compressed, so that they have their space sonically in the dynamics of the mix, and they're EQ'd really well, so that they have their space sonically within that frequency spectrum. So if you make space for things, both in terms of frequencies and dynamics, you don't have to blast the vocals so loud to be able to hear them. You can keep things more even. But yeah, obviously there are going to be differences. There need to be some differences in volume, and vocals will tend to be more on top of other things. Kick and snare will typically also be pretty far forward because that helps to really root the rhythm of the music. Kick and snare should typically be just as loud as each other. The kick drum is like one of the most energetic instruments in a band, so it's okay if it's a little bit louder, but you don't want there to be a vast difference between the two. I'm working on a mix right now for a friend, and he didn't give me the stems for the track, so I just have his vocal and I have the track. Because it's more expensive to buy the stems, and I don't like the way the track is mixed, and I can't fix it because I don't have the stems. And the kick is just so loud. Like I have VU meters that I can watch, and like the snare is like here, and then the kick is like way up here. Yeah, you want what you want in terms of low end is the low end should extend the depth of your mix, but it shouldn't increase volume drastically. Except maybe in the live context. Rules are a little bit different. For live, you're catering to your audience and the energy of the audience. Maybe they like hearing that bass just rumbling the building, so you might push it a little bit more. But generally speaking, low end should not change volume. It should just increase depth. And you'd want your kick and snare to be pretty loud and pretty even with each other.
How do you know when you need to use compressor?
I compress everything, not to the same extent. So what I would do, this is a very simple compressor. This is one knob compression. We'll get into all the parameters when we get into the digital board, but the parameters basically change as you turn it up. It keeps the volume consistent, and it just compresses it. So what I would do.
Quick question about the one knob compression.
Yeah.
So is that like pretty much every control that's on there? It's just it kind of does it.
Yeah, the settings change for you as you move the knob, and you can see a little graphic here that lays out how it changes. But basically, I would want to compress it enough to where I can control it and I can give it its own space in the mix, but not so much that it's squashed and the tone is being shaped in a way that sounds unnatural. Excuse me.
What does it do to the sound?
Well, not every frequency is equal in a source. Some frequencies are louder than others, so some frequencies are going to hit the compressor first before other frequencies do. And so it is going to have a tone shaping effect. Sometimes you might want that, especially if you're working with like a tube compressor, and there's some pleasant harmonics that can be added when you drive a compressor really hard on that. But most of the time you don't want to over compress. You just use your ears, know how you want it to sound, and just get more control over it. And if you're pushing it so much that you have control over it, but now it's sounding different than how you wanted it to sound, then you might need to back it off. So I just set compression on everything, but to different extents, just so I can get some good dynamic control over it. Again, not every analog board has a compressor. That board there doesn't have compression. For a board like this size, that's actually a pretty rare feature. Larger format consoles, you have matrices and like 10 auxes and all sorts of crazy things going on. Fully parametric EQs, but yeah, this one has a compressor. That's pretty cool, and it comes right after the preamp. And then after that, you have your EQ. And for some reason, it doesn't tell me what frequency each thing is. Typically, it's like the high frequency is like 12K. I think that one's 12K, and the low is like 100 or maybe 80. And we'll get to the mid in a second. But so this is just a single control for the high EQ. There's no. If you're familiar with EQs, you might on a digital console you're used to having like a gain control and a frequency control and a Q control, which controls the width. What this is, I'm pretty sure it's a shelf. I think that's the shape of it. So let's just say that this is 12,000. It probably is 12,000. That's pretty standard. So what that means is this controls primarily 12,000, but then the frequencies above that get trailed along with it. So it's a shelf. If I have this at 0, there's no change. If I turn it up, Well, now I'm boosting 12K, and then those other frequencies above it get dragged along with it. Nothing below that is affected. It's a high shelf. If I turn it down, then 12K gets turned down, and then the other frequencies get kind of trailed along with it, and then nothing below that is affected. It's just everything above 12K. And then same thing with the low frequency. Let's say that this is 100. The high pass up here is 80 hertz. Let's just say that this is 100. Same thing, it's a low shelf. So if this is 100, then when I turn it up, 100 hertz gets raised, and everything below that just kind of gets trailed along with it. And the same thing when I turn it down, you know, it goes down, and everything below that gets trailed along. This one has what's called a swept mid-range, or a semi-parametric mid-range. So I can select the frequency from 250 hertz up to 5,000 hertz. And then I can control the volume. The mid-range in an EQ like this, typically the high is a shelf and the low is a shelf, but the mid is a bell curve. So if I select 250 hertz, well, now it's a bell curve. So 250 is sort of the center frequency that's affected, and then everything, not everything, but within a certain range, below that and above that, other frequencies get trailed along with that in sort of a shape of a bell. If it's not a swept mid-range, if it's not semi-parametric, and you know there's a fixed frequency, it's usually going to be upper mid-range, like maybe 2.5K, but it's also a bell curve. You just can't select what the center frequency is for that. I find with analog mixers, obviously there's not as much you can do with it in terms of processing, but I find there's often not as much you have to do. They just tend to sound okay. There's just something about the summing and all the circuits that it's hitting as it goes through, and what's the word for it? I forget the term, but is it crosstalk? You know, there's some, even though they're supposed to be completely independent, the channels do kind of bleed into each other a little bit, which is not intentional, but it actually can enhance the sound and make it sound better. And there's actually there's plugins for like DAWs and digital consoles that try to imitate that analog crosstalk. I think it's called crosstalk. So I find analog consoles tend to sound pretty okay. They do have like a distinct analog sound that you might not like. You might prefer more of the transparency that you get with the digital console. But you know, if you like the way this sounds, it sounds quite nice without having to do a whole lot. What I find myself doing a lot with the EQ on an analog console is a lot of times I'm just turning everything down because I don't like the frequencies they have prefixed there. Like on a vocal, you know, they might be kissing the mic and it might be really boomy, so I'll put the high pass on there, but then it's not enough, so I'll turn down the low. And then 12K, I might want more 12K on the guitar to give it more presence, but then I don't want to put 12K into everything, so I might turn down 12K on the vocal. And then if it's not a swept mid-range, if it's 2.5K for some reason feeds back like everywhere, every venue I've been in, vocals, that frequency feeds back. So I'll often find myself just turning everything down on an analog console. And then on certain channels, I might boost something, like I might add 12K onto the guitar. I might beef up something like a piano if it's a solo piano or something like that. But there's not as much you can do in terms of tone shaping. When you have a swept mid-range, then there's more you can do. Then you can get a little more creative and you can select certain frequencies and turn them down or turn them up. But yeah, a lot of times when there's no swept mid-range, I'm just turning things down on most of the channels. And then there's certain channels where I'll turn up a little bit more.
So it's really not meant to really surgically EQ, it's just sort of general.
Right, because it's semi-parametric. Parametric is more surgical. That's where you can select the width, the Q. Q factor is what that's short for. It's like mathematics, and I forget all the theory, but yeah. But yeah, fully parametric, you can be surgical and you can zero in on that frequency that I want and turn it down and up or whatever. Yeah, so we've got our preamp, which includes a high-pass filter. That's part of the preamp. We've got a compressor. We've got our EQ. And we will return to these later when we get into routing. But these are your aux sends and your effect sends. Then the next thing is the pan pot. Pot is short for potentiometer.
I cook with pans.
You cook with pans.
Yeah.
You cook with pots.
I thought it was potentiiometer.
Potentiometer. Potato.
Photometer.
Potato.
Potato
Potato meter.
Someone had to say it.
Someone had to say it. And with that, I'm going to drink a water while you muse on about the wonders of potatoes.
Potato meter.
I don't know. Anybody?
Yeah, potentiometer. A potentiometer, it's not strictly an audio thing, it's just an electrical thing. It's a variable resistor. That's a potentiometer. That's a potentiometer. This is also a potentiometer. And really, I think all these things are different kinds of potentiometers. There's variable resistors. So you have your gain pot up here, and you've got your slide pots down here for the fader. And this is
potential.
Sure, you got great potential. Depends how you use them. You can do great things with them. That's a pan pot, and it controls. It is a control for the stereo imaging of the thing. So, if I pan it all the way to the left, then sound is going to come only out of the left speakers. If I pan it all the way to the right, sound will only come out of the right speakers. If I pan it to the center, sound will come equally out of the left and the right speakers. And then there's this cool psychoacoustic effect where if you're standing in the sweet spot right between those speakers, your brain interprets it as if it's coming from the center between the two speakers right in front of you. And that's actually really cool if you've never experienced it, really sitting in the sweet spot, like in a treated room between two speakers. And you getting the full-blown effect of that psychoacoustic effect. It's really something. Like it's like, wow, it's like right there in the room, right in front of me, even though it's actually coming out of both speakers at the same time. And this is a continuous pan, so it's not just left, hard left, hard right, and center, but I can do everything in between. And so I can give the illusion of the sound coming from different directions across the horizontal axis as I turn the pan pot around. And then when it comes to stereo pan in live sound, this is one of the great controversies of live sound. There's several, like, is analog better than digital? And do you set your gains with faders at 0 or with faders at infinity? This is another one of the great controversies. Oh, and then there's aux-fed subs. Do you feed your subwoofers through an aux, or do you feed it through a matrix? But anyway, one of the great controversies, should you run a live show in stereo or should you run it in mono? Because the idea is, if you run it in stereo, almost nobody is going to be sitting in the sweet spot to get the full-blown psychoacoustic effect. So no one's really going to hear the stereo image. In fact, it literally might be nobody. There might be a center aisle, and literally nobody is sitting there. And depending on the size of the venue and how you have things positioned, if you pan something hard right to get like this really cool stereo effect, well, the people on the left side of the room might not hear it at all. So to what extent should you do stereo, or should you do stereo at all? And then when you have like really crazy sound systems where you have like all these different clusters and stacks and line arrays and fills and front fills, delay fills, you have all these different speakers. Where is the sweet spot? I mean, you can't really build the stereo image. You just have, cluster aimed over there and line array aimed over there, and there's not really a sweet spot. So some engineers will only run things mono for live shows, and they swear by that. And they'll say, if you're good at mixing, you don't need stereo anyway. Stereo is just like a little icing on the cake, but you should be able to craft a good mix within a mono space. So some engineers will do mono only, and then others just love stereo and they just can't get get away from stereo and they just love crafting this stereo image. For me personally, I mean, it depends on the context. Like if you're in that crazy sound system context where you have clusters and stuff aimed in all sorts of different directions, probably doesn't make a lot of sense to do anything mono. I mean, anything stereo. You might just leave everything mono. But for the most part, for what we do around here, where it's not crazy large scale, it's more small to medium scale events, I do like doing a little bit of stereo. I just won't go crazy. I won't pan anything really hard left or right. I'll keep a lot of things central, but I might just pan just a little bit.
Do you pan the drums stuff? Because you're a drummer, I bet you.
Yeah, I do like that. I am a drummer.
He's clearly.
Oh, really? You're a drummer?
Yeah, I did not. I was gonna ask eventually. I was like, can I just run in the chapel casually and
I've done it
Sure.
before.
Well, I'm on recording, so I think it's okay.
Okay, all right.
I asked Zach Drum about
That can
that.
always be cut.
We'll cut that.
We cut that part out. Typically the low end in modern mixing theory, this has changed. If you go back to the Beatles and other recordings, like older recordings, you'll hear weird panning things, like they'll have like the center vocal pan hard left and like the bass guitar on the right. It's when you're listening on headphones, it's like, what is this? But where mixing theory has sort of developed and become standardized today is that your low end should be hard center and your main vocals should be centered. So your kick drum will be center. It's not a bad idea to put your snare centered also, even though it's not low end. Vocal center. Sometimes I like to pan things as they are arranged on the stage because I feel like it can be kind of weird psychologically if I see the guitarist over there but I'm hearing him from over there. So yeah, I don't. It depends. Sometimes it sounds nice, like doing stereo keys left, right, and then having like the drummer when he goes through the toms, you hear it go. Boop, 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 boop. Sometimes that's cool, but sometimes I like to just kind of match what's on the stage. So if all the drums are over there, well, I'll still leave the kick center and maybe the snare center, but I'll pan things more over to where the drummer is physically located. And I think it just makes it feel more natural because you're hearing things where they're actually located visually. Right. The panning can be useful also to create space for things. Again, you're creating space for things dynamically. You're creating space for things across frequencies, and then you can also separate things with stereo pan. But I would say, I do agree. If you're good at mixing, you don't need stereo pan to get a clear sounding mix.
Is that why it's kind of like sort of? I've just seen a lot of little like tips and tricks. It's like really mixing my stuff.
Yeah, it's a good idea to start mixing in a studio setting. Mix in mono first. Make it sound.
So that's the stereo I meant. Mono.
Yeah, I know what you meant, but it's a good idea to just mix in mono first, and then after you've got it sounding really good and polished with your effects and everything, then bring in the stereo and start polishing that up a little bit.
Would that become like the same thing in a live setting, or is it really just
Live is different. I mean, live, you're amplifying sound that's already in the room.
Right.
So, yeah, it is a different story. But I would just say you shouldn't need stereo panning to clear up your mix, but it can be helpful. So it would be good to learn how to get a really clear mix, just working with your dynamics and your EQ and your levels before you start reaching for your pan pots. But if you're really good at that and you've done what you can here, then yeah, it can be helpful and it can just be nice. It sounds nice sometimes to separate things in the stereo space. So there you go. Preamp, compressor, EQ, pan pot. Next we have the mute button, but on Yamaha boards, it's not a mute button, it's an on button. So when the light shines, it's not muted, it's on, which can be confusing, and I don't like it. I like my mutes better, but that's another reason why I'm showing you on this board, so you're aware there are different ways that things are done. Yamaha loves their on buttons. So when the light is off, nothing will go through. When it's on, it's on. And then you have your fader, which is a potentiometer. It's a sliding pot. Couple things to know about the fader. The fader resolution is different at different points along the track here. And you can see it just looking at the numbers there. So like a distance from here to here, like half an inch, that's 5 decibels. But if I go all the way down here, that same distance is like, what is that? 25 decibels. So it's easier to make fine-tuned changes up here because it's a higher fader resolution. It's more difficult to make fine-tuned changes down at the bottom here because it's a lower fader resolution. If I just bump it a little bit, big change. And that's something to keep in mind when you're setting your gains, which again, you want to do early. You don't want to be changing gains in the middle of the show because that affects everything. But when you're setting your gains at the beginning of the show, maybe you do everything technically correct and you're watching your meter and you gain it up and you're getting strong signal and you have plenty of headroom, but maybe the signal, even though you did it correctly, the signal is so strong that your fader ends up way down here. That's not very practical. So you might end up gaining down and fading up until you're back within a practical range where you have a higher fader resolution. You can make those fine-tuned changes. Another thing that can be helpful to know about a fader, it can be kind of confusing, so I'm going to explain it, and then I'm going to explain why you don't have to think about it, but it's just good to know. Sometimes, again, you'll forget that the preamp comes first and you're afraid of peaking and you won't want to turn the fader up even though that doesn't really affect anything on the preamp, or you see it peaking and you try to fix that by turning that down. Sometimes that comes from just forgetting where the preamp is in the signal flow, but it can also just come from not understanding what the fader is actually doing, because you see these numbers here, you see 0, you see -10, and you see +10 up here, and so you're thinking, well, I'm adding 10 dB, so what does that do? Where's that extra 10 dB going if it's not going up here? Or you might just be confused, why is 0 here? Why isn't 0 down at the bottom? So the way a fader works, a fader has no mechanism for boosting volume. A fader is a passive circuit, does not add any energy to the signal. So when the fader's all the way at the top, that is actually 0. That's true 0. The fader's not changing anything when the fader's all the way at the top. It's a fader, it fades signal. So at the top, you're getting the full-blown signal from the preamp, wherever your preamp is set. But then as you turn it down, now you're turning it down. Fader does not turn anything up. It only turns things down. So then what's going on with these numbers? Why does it say +10? Is it a lie? Is the cake a lie?
It's deceiving me.
It's deceiving you. Well, there's actually another amplifier in the soundboard that you cannot see and you cannot control. It's a fixed gain stage, and it amplifies the signal by whatever the top number is on the fader. So the top number here is 10. So the signal on this channel is always being amplified another 10 decibels somewhere after the preamp. I forget exactly where it is in the signal chain. So what that means is when I have the fader all the way at the top, the fader's not changing anything. The fader is 0, but the signal is being boosted another 10 decibels. So it really is 10 decibels louder than what you're getting from the preamp when the fader's all the way at the top. When I put the fader down at unity, which is another word for 0, the unity is 0. Sometimes you'll see a U there instead of a 0. When I put the fader down there at 0, well, now technically the fader is taking the signal down 10 dB, but then that extra amplifier is bringing it back up 10 dB, and so it is effectively 0. So why do they do it that way? I'm not exactly sure. I guess it's just So you are able to, in a sense, add signal, make it louder or softer. And then the numbers are there just for your convenience, so you don't have to do the math and you don't have to think about the fact that there's another amplifier in there. You can just look at the numbers and be like, oh, now it's 10 dB louder and now it's at 0. But the fader itself is not actually boosting anything. It's that other gain stage in there that's doing that. And that's the channel strip. Strictly speaking, channel strip, by the way, I'm oversimplifying. Channel strip is really just the preamp and then any sort of processing in there. But for simplicity's sake, I'm just calling the whole thing a channel strip. You can buy gear, channel strips. You can put them on a rack, and the channel strip is just like an extra preamp and then some processing. And anyway, so yeah, that's the channel strip. Again, we'll come back to these in a moment, and we're going to get into routing next. But before we get into routing, any questions so far about any of this? All makes sense?